Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 74 of Ancient Office Hours. I'm very excited to bring you this week's delightful conversation with Dr. Jackson Crawford, an Old Norse expert and full-time public educator on YouTube. He received his PhD in Scandinavian Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his MA in Linguistics from the University of Georgia. For 8 years, he was full-time faculty in Scandinavian Studies, teaching courses in Norse language, myth, and sagas at UCLA, UC Berkeley, and the University of Colorado at Boulder. In recent years, he has been an Old Norse language and runes consultant on major multimedia projects, such as Ubisoft Montreal's Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Disney's Frozen. In this episode, we discussed the unique challenges to being a full-time YouTube public scholar in Old Norse studies, his experience on consulting for major Hollywood and gaming projects, and why people associate Norway and Denmark with Vikings more than Iceland, from where most of the primary texts originate. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, as this will allow us to reach more people and make more exciting ancient world content. Enjoy! Great. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, and I want to just start you off with what I hope is going to be a really softball question, which is, how did you get into the study of the ancient world? Where did your passion for ancient Norse culture come from?
What started out as an interest in ancient life. So I grew up west of Denver, down the canyons, and there's a lot of paleontological sites and a lot of local interest in fossils and dinosaurs and such. And I grew up as a really obsessive dinosaur kid, as did one of my best friends who actually became a paleontologist. But in middle school, when I had to decide what language I wanted to take, I took Latin because the dinosaur names were in Latin. And I got fascinated with ancient languages and how those languages had evolved into the languages of today. And so that led me to self-study of Old English when I stumbled on a copy of an Old English grammar in a Denver bookstore, and then to Old Norse and actually a lot of other Indo-European languages in college and grad school. But I specialized in Old Norse at the PhD level because I was really interested in kind of the duality of how it was both a very close relative of English, but also one that had gone off very much in its own direction.
That's really cool. I wonder, I feel like most people have to go through a Shakespeare, Beowulf, Canterbury Tales phase in school at some level. Was that also kind of a hook? Were you just fascinated by how this language thing worked when reading these sort of epic or just well-known pieces that we have today?
Language was the big hook. I never had a Chaucer or Shakespeare phase, really. I mean, in my 30s, I maybe had a very short Shakespeare phase, but I don't think that counts. I did read Beowulf in high school on my own, but I think Chaucer was too cursed by actually being taught in high school. Anything that was actually taught in an English class, I didn't want anything to do with. So no, it was mostly the language itself. I did come to the literature kind of independently because I had this weird class in 7th grade that was called adolescent literature. Actually, all we did in that class was read. The teacher mostly just let people read whatever they wanted, but for whatever reason, she decided that I was her special project. So she made me read a lot of the classics, and I read Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which is mostly about Greek mythology, but does have a little appendix about Norse mythology. And so that was my first independent introduction to that. But the main thing that stuck with me from that was the quotes from Albemarle, the poem of Odin's wisdom, not so much the actual stories or anything like that.
Well, the language usually is a big hook, whether that's Latin or a different ancient language. But since you did start with Latin, because I think a lot of us who are into the ancient fields, we do start with paleontology. It definitely starts with the dinosaurs. I went through a huge dinosaur phase where I was like, oh, all I'm going to do is dig up old dinosaur bones. It's going to be great. And then obviously that didn't happen. So
have you been on a dinosaur dig?
No, the closest I've come to is I grew up in Chicago. And so at oh no, what museum was it? I don't think it was Field Museum. It was a different museum, but they had like a simulated little dinosaur diggy exhibit where you could go and they gave you trowels and then they teach you to sort of dig up fake bones.
Well, I've been on the real thing. It's pretty cool. So I'll do a semi-plug. We do digs in the summer just about every weekend. We take people up from the Morrison Museum in Colorado up to Glen Rock, Wyoming, and do real dinosaur digs. So you really can do it. It's a lot of fun.
Well, now I need to look into this because that sounds really fun, and I would enjoy it coming to it later when I'm not a dreamy 10-year-old or something like that, dreaming of just randomly digging up bones. But having started with Latin, because that's what we really use for scientific names and terms, did you ever have such an interest in Latin that you considered for a second going into classics?
Yes, I did. My undergraduate degree is in classics. I spent one semester as a classics master's student before I was a linguistics master's student. So yeah, I did consider it. I did Latin and Greek, although I was in the weird position of liking Latin better as a language, liking Greek literature better. Maybe that's not such an uncommon position, but
I don't think it's uncommon. I feel like I have enough friends in classics that they had also things where, oh, well, I like this language better, but I like the tragedians in this other one better. So I don't think that's the strangest, but yeah, it's a hard world going through, but it's pretty cool that you switched and kind of got off classics is so single-minded, I feel like, because when you're on classics, they just tell you, okay, you pick up the two languages and then you kind of have to pick one eventually and then you go and do the X, Y, or Z. So to have the wherewithal to be like, I'm going to jump off and I'm going to switch into something else like linguistics, when you're like, that's a whole nother world you can just veer into. That's pretty cool. I want to know though, once you eventually got off the classics track and decided your home was linguistics, and then when you got into your PhD program, or actually even before then, you picked up that master's, but then can you walk me through a bit the process of deciding what you wanted to specialize in for a PhD program? Was that like a very easy decision, or did it require a lot of sitting and being like, oh, okay, so I have a lot of options because I have this linguistical background and there's a huge buffet here?
Well, I don't know that I ever felt that I really had a lot of options. I guess there's a few aspects to this. So I did my master's degree at the University of Georgia, and the linguistics program there run then and now by Jared Klein, the finest teacher I've ever had. And he insisted that all of us, no matter what, have a firm background in all possible ancient Indo-European languages. And we were a really socially tightly bound group. We all really liked each other. We all hung out outside of class, and we were just this intolerable gang of Indo-Europeanist grad students. And I think part of actually what shaped all of our fates is that we were all taking all of these languages, and eventually, almost like a superhero team or something, we each adopted kind of one part of it as ours. So we wound up kind of having like an Anatolian guy, an Indic guy, a sort of classical languages guy. And I just sort of, by my longstanding interest in it, gravitated toward being the Norse/Germanic guy, although there was kind of another Old English guy. And so my master's thesis was actually in the historical syntax of Icelandic. My advisor, Dr. Klein, kind of told everyone that he was pretty good at reminding us that, we might just be marching off into a jobless wasteland. But he he did say that he thought people had a better chance if they specialized in something. So he said, what you want to do is you either want to apply to a linguistics department as the X language guy, or you want to apply to that language department as the linguistics guy. So I did both. And I assumed, just based on percentages from when I'd applied to my master's or percentages from, dating or whatever, that, you shotgun out there and, one place is going to accept you maybe. So I figured that was exactly what was going to happen. One of these places will accept me, and that's just what I'm going to do. And that is what happened. So I got accepted at the University of Wisconsin at the Scandinavian department. It was at the time a distinct department. It isn't anymore. And I just went in as sort of the historical linguistics guy in the Scandinavian department.
It's interesting that you did have to go through the linguistics route, which is not uncommon to hear these days for people when they're trying to get to a certain place or trying to position themselves closer to a certain specialty. But I'm curious to know whether you've noticed a marked change, either for better or for worse, between when you were applying and now, like when advising students. Are there more departments of Scandinavian studies around now for students to be able to target and say, okay, well, this is where I can go? Or have you seen sort of the trend and availability of these programs sort of follow the rest of the humanities trend where there are fewer? So if you wanted to try to go into something like classics or Scandinavian studies, you do actually have to go in through a different department that may be bigger and sort of encompass you.
Yeah, that's absolutely been the trend. I know of at least 2 distinct Scandinavian departments that have collapsed, been folded into. Usually what they do is they put German, Slavic, and Scandinavian together. So that's what happened at Wisconsin. That's how it is at Colorado, the last institution I was at. Usually Scandinavian is in the weird position of being this sort of unacknowledged piggy bank for German and Slavic, because you get very few majors out of it, but you get some super popular classes out of it, right? Lots of people want to take Vikings for their history credit or Norse myth for a lit credit or something. So more or less, you wind up with departments that just look at it that way. They're not super willing to take grad students in Scandinavian. Yeah, it's probably worse overall, although I don't know that it's worse, but I suspect that it's broadly worse. I
mean, that would unfortunately track with just the current trend for the humanities in general. Unfortunately, just with programs being cut everywhere in the world, and to not even have it be just a unique problem here. It's everywhere, unfortunately.
And it's weird because the interest is so high. People are always surprised. I'm actually with strangers or, new people I meet, I'm always fairly reluctant to bring up what I do because there's such a predictable set of statements and questions that come in response to it. One of which is, oh, that's so niche. I can't imagine anyone could make a living off of that. It's like, I don't know. I taught the second biggest classes at the University of Colorado during the 3 years I was there. One could hypothetically make a living off of the royalties for the translations I do of Old Norse stuff. I mean, not a great living, but you could make a living. The public interest is enormous in this stuff. But yeah, but finding the money is damn hard.
And I wonder, it seems like that encounters the same problem that most classics departments do, which is like the big intro myth class, right? Is the biggest, most popular. You get 400 some students in it if you are at an institution that big. But then when you want to offer like the more targeted upper level courses, those don't tend to fill up, which, I mean, it makes sense, but it's unfortunate, isn't it?
It's hard to know what to make of where to go from there. I think I have found sort of a way forward by taking that engagement out of the classroom, by saying, a lot of the people who want this information are not people who even can come to the classroom, and trying to find them outside of there. But not everyone has the interest or the will or the resources. Maybe, I guess resources are probably the least of a barrier there to reach out to the public that way.
I mean, gatekeeping is a big problem in academia everywhere, but it is interesting. I talk a lot about public scholarship, both on the show and just to people I know, whoever I meet, I'll talk a lot about it. But also, I think it goes outside of people who know what it takes within the academic circles. Public education really is not as easy, I think, as we assume it might be. I mean, because I meet a lot of people who say, oh, someone is really good at this. Why don't you just offer classes to the public? Someone will take it. The interest is there, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually quite hard. And the time investment. So it's quite an interesting place to be, I would imagine, that if you're an educator and you're like, there is interest, and I know that actually the biggest enthusiasts and people who would take this are not going to be at an institution. Oh, but I don't have the time or the energy to do this. So that then kind of leaves us with the conundrum, right, of, well, how do we go forward? How do we move forward? Because there is a push toward more sort of public education, but the more we think about it, it's not really sustainable.
Well, I think you could probably relate to something that I tell a lot of people who are considering this, doing something like I do on YouTube or, a podcast or something like that. As I say, it takes a lot of pushing that rock up the hill to get it to start rolling on its own down the hill. And the biggest problem you're going to find is once you get that rock rolling down the hill, it will eventually bottom out, and then you've got to push it again. Like, it's not like these are not self-perpetuating, mechanisms. You have to continually put effort in. You have no idea, unless you're a brilliantly wiser person than I am, what's going to do well, right? I put out 2 videos a week. My best guesses about what videos will reach a lot of people are invariably wrong, and vice versa. I go through slumps I can't explain because I think I'm giving people exactly what they want. And then I have hits I can't explain because I think I literally put this together on a bus ride. So it's just unaccountable. And you have to have more psychologically prepared for that first push up the hill. Like, oh, I know that, in the first 6 months, it's not like I'm going to be able to pay my bills with this. But you have to be ready for what happens after your first big quote unquote hit, and you don't have another quote unquote hit for another 6 months. Like, can you get yourself through that? And I think that's where most people drop out. It's not that first push, it's the later push.
That's a really good point, because sometimes the first push up the hill is so hard. Most people give up there, right? They don't even get to the point where they're ready for it to roll down and then have to figure out, okay, what comes next. So it's an interesting position if you even get past that first push. It's really, really hard. Major props to people who can make it that far, because I know it's terrifying not to think, oh, what comes next? But if you've made it to that point.
My biggest problem is I never know when to give up on anything that I start doing. So I had enough of that, obsessive energy to keep pushing through when this wasn't my job, right? When I was teaching full time and writing books and trying to get stuff published. Not everyone has that. And then some people, especially on different adjunct track jobs, are working so many different jobs that no matter how much energy they have, they're never going to find the time. You also have to have somewhere in your time, some corner, some hour that you can put into this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Also, though, luckily, when dealing with the ancient world, there's no shortage of good materials that you can take and do something exciting with, which is a nice feature of what we study. But again, it's hard. It's hard to reach people. You never know what's going to land. So a question I see a lot of academics really grappling with, and we spend a lot of time oscillating back and forth between, is are our fates as we go forward increasingly intertwined with like media projects, films, TV shows? Because I feel like, yes, there's a big interest in things like, Old Norse and Vikings. But I remember that I didn't hear people talking so much about this and like serious interest until things like the Vikings TV show came up, or The Last Kingdom, and some of these big shows. And then suddenly everyone's talking about it. And then suddenly I know 10 people who have never shown any interest whatsoever beyond just, oh, the Vikings were cool, I guess, to where can I find a class on this? Where can I find resources? What books should I read? And I'm like, so all these questions apparently were sparked because they saw something they liked on TV. And that happens obviously with ancient Greek and Roman things too. So is it kind of like, are our fates tied together, or is there a way where people in academia can find something that's not just relying on major media to sort of further interest?
Mainstream public interest is so fickle. There is some chicken and egg issue here. There's a big-ish and growing subculture that really identifies itself with Vikings and Old Norse stuff. And there's a lot of different versions of the subculture, but you can find it out there. I don't know if they physically gather anywhere very often, but they certainly find each other on the internet. Those people are always kind of ready for this kind of material. How much the general public at large is ready for it, I think that depends year to year. And some of these things blow up for a while and then recede, and some of them just stay blown up. I mean, I feel like another thing we talked about earlier, dinosaurs kind of started blowing up around Jurassic Park and never really stopped being popular. I think Viking stuff started blowing up around when the Lord of the Rings movies came out, and I don't think that's really stopped being popular. But by contrast, I feel like there was a really big boom of interest in Sparta and ancient Greece around when 300 came out, and I feel like that's kind of receded. I don't see as much interest in that outside of a few subcultures. So I don't think you can predict this stuff. You know, I've been attached to some movie and video game projects and TV shows, but I'm pretty hesitant to talk so much about that I'm identifying myself with it very much, because I feel like you just never know how popular stuff will stay, how much it will, you know, continue to be of interest to people, or will it actually become vilified one way or another? You know, I just think it's just too unpredictable. And also, by the way, when I try to make videos to latch on to something that seems popular at the moment, you know, a Thor movie comes out, so I try to make a movie about Thor or whatever. You know, I worked on Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so I try to release a video about that when Assassin's Creed Valhalla comes out. There's almost no connection between me doing a real topical video and getting actual, like, lots of views. So I don't think that we should attach ourselves too much to that kind of thing.
It's such an interesting perspective, because I have talked to some of the game devs for different games. I talked to one writer who worked on both Odyssey and Valhalla, so she had the unique perspective of looking at two very different cultures, but also that would appeal to the same sect of people, can we say? I mean, the ancient world enthusiasts. It is interesting to come from this perspective of saying, you know, I've done the big media thing, and to have your name on something big like an Assassin's Creed game too, I feel like gives you a unique perspective, because there's a ton of young academics I know who are like just raring to, you know, sink their claws into a big project like that and hope that it sort of takes them somewhere. But it's true. I mean, people are changeable and you never know what will hit. My own journey just with discovering more outside of the ancient Mediterranean is so tied closely to that game, I will say. And I wonder whether so much of public interest is not driven so much just by the genre itself that you're doing, but it has to have some kind of almost like emotional connection of feeling invested, like you're doing it. Right, because I've watched Vikings, I've watched The Last Kingdom. Now, I love both shows, but in having watched them, you know, I never kind of came away thinking, you know, it'd be kind of fun to learn Old Norse or take a couple classes to learn more. I just said, you know, this is a cool time period that I'm interested in, but I'll leave it here. But when Valhalla came out, that was the first time that I was like, okay, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna invest like 400 hours into platinuming the game. So after like 400 hours with this thing, I was super invested, and I was like, darn it, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna find some classes and I'm gonna learn more and do all the things and even look for master's programs in Old Norse studies. But I don't know if I'm the majority or the minority.
If you think that getting better Old Norse into a TV show or something is going to increase interest in Old Norse, I mean, remind yourself when the last time you watched a Star Wars movie and decided to go learn how to build rockets was. I mean, that filter does not produce that many people. Also, my handwriting is in, I think, like the highest grossing motion picture of all time. Like, what does that do for me? Like nobody knows that. You tell people that, and the reaction is not, wow, let me bankroll your salary. It's, first time you get approached by some big Hollywood or video game studio project, it's kind of like, wow, my name is going to be on this thing. And then the second time you're like, yeah, my name is going to be on this thing in a place nobody sees it. And so I better just make enough money to make this worth my time. And that's kind of it. I mean, like the excitement kind of bleeds out of it when you realize that it doesn't really contribute to your influence or whatever.
It's an interesting point because I know, and I've had this discussion. I'm in like a Twitter classics group. Let's call it just group. I don't know what it actually is, but we recently had this great discussion on, would you rather try to get a big break and have like one massive entity approach you and try to get your work there so you can use that as a credit? Or is kind of the future of this public scholarship thing like almost like a crowdfunded, crowdsourced approach where, like, yes, it's a lot of time and effort because obviously, and I think I know you've spoken about it in the past on something that I watched, but like, I know trying to do individual translations for people is ridiculous because the volume is going to be huge and you don't have enough time in the world to do so. But this idea, though, of like crowdfunded, if you get enough people because the volume is so high, could it end up being more financially and name recognition wise profitable, but also just a better use of, I don't want to say time, but better way to get your name out there?
I think crowdfunding and my decade of experience suggests that it is absolutely the way to go. The only media project I ever did that I could have paid my rent with briefly was Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Otherwise, it's only ever been some minor supplement. Crowdfunding, however, I got on Patreon in mid 2016, and by fall 2019, it was my primary source of income, even above teaching, even above royalties. And so in 2020, I quit teaching. And so to this day, I pay my rent and stuff with Patreon. That is the closest, obviously, that I've ever come to making, a living with something. And so I do recommend it to people. Academics have a really, really hard time learning the marketing skills that you need to make that work. And I am no exception, and I have never really learned it particularly well. I think I probably leave a lot of stones unturned that I could turn in this crowdfunding world that I just don't think about because I'm not a natural marketer. I'm not a natural salesman, But I try to remind myself to mention Patreon. And of course, I'm very appreciative of the people who support me there. I've done a lot of experiments with what exactly I should do to kind of pay them back. Right now, the biggest thing is they get to come live to the interviews that I conduct with experts and ask their questions. And they also get a monthly Zoom with me where they get to ask stuff about Old Norse. I've tried other things, but mostly the people who get on there are just people who are kind of saying thank you for what you already do. And I'm a patron myself of some things like that. Like, I'm a patron of my favorite podcast. And it's just because I think to myself, well, this $5 a month that I give them helps them continue making this podcast. So, and most people support me in the same spirit. They're not there for perks per se. So I do encourage creators to try that, but it's another thing where for 6 months, you're not going to see much. It takes really consistent, persistent effort for a long time. When
you have to turn yourself into kind of a marketer of yourself and what you do. And definitely those skills they don't come the most naturally to people who want to kind of hide away, right, in the stacks and just read the ancient things and translate and work on that kind of stuff. I'm a big believer in we're all kind of introverts who like to be left on our own, which is why we put ourselves through this schooling thing.
I mean, there's obviously a whole spectrum between absolute introvert and absolute extrovert. No one who gets a PhD is hard against the edge of the extrovert side of that spectrum, right? I mean, it's just impossible to be that research oriented. So these skills typically don't overlap well. And, for me, it is something that I've had to semi-learn. It is to some degree learnable. You only have to do what you're comfortable with. I certainly don't cross a lot of lines that I would be uncomfortable crossing. Although people have suggested that I cross various lines I'd be uncomfortable crossing.
Well, that's the age-old issue, isn't it? How far am I willing to go for my craft or my passion? It's a tough one, but I want to turn a little bit for my listeners who are not so up with the Old Norse world and Scandinavian studies world, because I can't get around it. I'm a classicist, so the bend is always classics. So one thing I've been working my way through is, I don't know if you can see it through my filter, but I have your translated copy. This was one of my first, so one of the things I did when I just moved out to LA for a job at UCLA. And one of the things I did once I had access to a nice library was I went out and I took like 20 books out of the library, all on like Scandinavian studies, Old Norse, because I was like, okay, now I'm just going to invest myself because I'm finally in a place where I can read the books and I can do the personal research. But I was discovering as I'm starting to read through things, and a lot of my friends are asking, because they're like, this is a new trend for you. What are the good books to read? What are the sources? And I definitely found accessing and getting the mythology we have and the writings, it's more difficult than going to find some books on classics. So for people who are unfamiliar, I'm hoping you can walk us through your translated text here, just like a brief, what is it? And also, why are these resources so hard to find if you don't kind of know someone who's done it? Or
Sure. I'll take that first part, but second part first. It is relatively hard to find good resources about language and literature and myth. The experts don't like the public that they think wants it. There is this perception within Scandinavian faculties and PhD programs that we're the only people who like this who aren't neo-Nazis. Anything you put out into the public, remember, a neo-Nazi could read that. It's well, the fact is, yeah, those people are there. I've certainly had my problems with them, but they're a pretty small percentage of the public that's interested in this stuff. And if you're trying to keep information out of their hands, what you're actually doing is keeping information out of the hands of a whole lot of good people who then look for information, and the information they find may be what some obsessive neo-Nazi puts on a website, or what some really self-serving person has put into a book. I mean, some of the books that are out there, they're not by neo-Nazis necessarily, but they may be by really self-serving people who don't have the expertise they pretend to. So what is the Poetic Edda? Iceland was converted to Christianity in about the year 1000. And most of Scandinavia a little bit before that or a little bit after that. So you have a pretty clean dividing line between pre-Christian and Christian Scandinavia at about the 1000 AD line. But in Iceland, there continued to be a great deal of interest in the pre-Christian myths and stories. This seems to have been mostly an antiquarian interest. Icelanders have a long tradition as a very literate, both in the sense of reading a lot and the sense of just telling stories a lot, people. And a people very interested in their own past. And by the 1200s, which was a period of civil war in Iceland, it seems like this sort of crested into this period of producing nostalgic literature. And so they wrote down not only the great sagas of Icelanders, somewhat equivalent to Westerns in a U.S. context, right? They're about a time when Iceland was a frontier and men were men, right? And they fought things out with a duel rather than less glamorous fighting of their Civil War period. But they also wrote down the traditional poems that have been passed down about the Norse gods and the pre-Christian heroes. So you have the Poetic Edda is a compilation of about 30 poems. I say about 30 because people disagree about exactly where some end and begin, things like that. The first half concern the Norse gods. So these are our, if you will, most authentic pre-Christian stories about Odin, Thor, Loki. And then the last half is about the Volsung heroes, which are, that material is somewhat equivalent to an Iliad. There's also the Prose Edda, which anyone who wants to read, I recommend the translation by Anthony Fawkes, which is marketed somewhat confusingly just under the title Edda. But the Prose Edda was written by an individual named Snorri Sturluson in Iceland in the 1220s AD. And he knew many of the poems that made it into the Poetic Edda. He also knew some others that didn't. And so he recounts the mythology in a probably somewhat too cohesive form. He wants to make more sense than it does because a lot of these poems actually contradict each other quite a bit. But his Prose Edda is a valuable source as well. So those two books together are 95% of what we know about the mythology of pre-Christian Scandinavia.
Now, I do want to ask, because this is something that I think I read or picked up as I'm going through a lot of these books that I have stacked on my desk now, is that unlike Greek mythology, where we have a lot of stories and a lot of just evidence of the ancients talking about their own mythology. And so now we have this long literary tradition of looking at the mythology and for ancient Rome as well. Isn't part of the problem with Norse mythology that the ancients themselves, because they were mostly a storytelling culture, they didn't really write this down. And so by the time it's written down, a lot of the mythology was susceptible to having like a distinctive Christian bend just due to the conversion of Iceland to Christianity. And that's really when they started writing it down. So is it true that we do have kind of a bit of trouble distinguishing, when was something written? Was it written with something else in mind? How do we separate and decipher really what the ancients had, just due to it being written down later?
Well, of course. And it's a little bit of a case-by-case problem. With the Prose Edda, you have Snorri Sturluson, who's a medieval Christian and a very learned medieval Christian. And his attempt to find out, what was like the story out of competing stories has a very Christian bent to it, right? What is the, if you will, orthodox pre-Christian story is what he's looking for. And there wasn't one, right? These stories differed from place to place and time to time. In the poems of the Poetic Edda, linguistics can help us here. Some poems definitely have archaic linguistic characteristics. But of course, there's questions here because you can imitate an earlier language style if you know that is an earlier language style. So, for example, people today, when they want to sound old-fashioned, they may throw in a thou or a thee, or they might add us to various words. Most people don't know where to use thou. Most people don't know where to add that us, but they have kind of a sense of what sounds old-ish. Someone like you or me might actually be able to do a pretty passable job of putting those us in the right places and putting thou in the right places. So you have to wonder if there's people who do know how to do that at a later stage and can make something look artificially more archaic. I hesitate to think so if you have language features that make something work as a good poem in the 900s AD, but that poem is written down in the 1200s AD, I tend to think that a 1200s poet is not going to be willing to make, quote, bad poetry to make it sound more archaic. That makes me say, okay, this is a legitimately archaic poem that's being passed down orally by people who no longer understand why it even works as poetry, but they're passing it down and then getting written down in the later period. That kind of thing, I think, is actually fairly secure. And we do have poems like that. And then we have poems that are just so confused in their transmission. It's like we can't even tell what the word is like a third of the time. There's a poem, the Poetic Edda Hemiskvi, one about Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. There's so many just completely garbled words in the transmission of that poem, which, also tends to make me think, well, this is legitimately archaic. It's being passed down by people who don't understand what they're passing down at all anymore, to the point they don't even know what word to write. That gives me a little bit more confidence. Then you have little details that wind up being preserved from the actual pre-Christian period. So, for example, Snorri in his Prose Edda, when he's talking about the story of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, says that Thor struggled so hard with his fishing rod that his foot shot out of the bottom of the boat. And in fact, there is a Viking Age picture stone from Sweden that depicts Thor standing in a boat with his hammer, fishing for the Midgard serpent, with his foot going out the bottom of the boat. So that's a detail, Snorri didn't see this stone. So that's a detail that seemed to be legitimately passed down from an earlier period. So I don't think that any particular poem or story in the Prose Edda is exactly what anyone was saying in the pre-Christian period. But I think that it often is largely pre-Christian material.
I think for the casual enthusiast here who does not have access to someone who can tell them this, or who just isn't going to go and try to dig this up, I think it's really handy and helpful to know this. But also, I'm kind of curious, one thing that Greek and Roman mythology also have is a concept of a very linear timeline for their mythology. But one thing that makes Norse mythology a bit harder for the lay person to sort of grapple with is this idea of cyclical mythological time. And I wonder, does the cyclical nature of mythology make it harder and a bit more inaccessible for people to understand?
I don't actually know that the Norse have a cyclical view of time. That is a notion that's become pretty popular. It's based largely on the fact that we hear that Ragnarok will come and all the gods will die and just about all the people will die and the earth will be destroyed. But then we hear the earth will be reborn. There will be a few god survivors, or a couple gods come back from the dead. A couple humans will survive, and there will be this paradise. But at least one of the monsters that fought the gods will survive too. So it kind of implies a cycle, but it never actually says that it's a cycle. As far as we know, there's one Ragnarok. The world is reborn once. Yes, evil is reborn too, but it doesn't say there's a constant cycle of Ragnarok and rebirth. That's just an implication that people have drawn from it that I'm actually not willing to draw from it. I'm kind of agnostic on the question, but I don't think they have a particularly cyclical view of time.
Fair. I don't know much about it, but I picked up one of the sort of beginning of Norse mythology books that I have. The scholar who wrote it posited that it is more cyclical than others. So I just read a whole section on it, which is why I got thinking about it.
Well, it's an opinion that's out there. I just, I'm not particularly persuaded. I don't see a whole lot to ever make me think they're all that cyclical in their way of thinking about stuff.
I mean, I think it's really good to see both sides and hear both sides of the debate, honestly. So you are a linguist, and so I am very happy to be able to ask this. So when I studied abroad in the UK for a semester, and I was sort of tricked into taking a Scandinavian civilization course, or it had some name like that. They clearly marketed it as a Viking course. So when they were coming and trying to get people to enroll, the professor came in wearing like a Viking helmet and was like, "Let's learn about the Vikings." And I was like, "Okay, this is strange, but sure, it's different from what I do, so let me take it." And then I was very disappointed that there were like 2 lectures on the Vikings, and then the rest was like more modern, like 17th, 18th century Scandinavian history. And then I was like, okay, well, this isn't a Viking course. That's 2 lectures. So now I'm disappointed. From what I gathered and from what I've been able to learn it's quite interesting. I find it quite interesting that they say that Icelandic is the closest thing we have to Old Norse. And so I'm wondering if you agree with this, one, and then it's kind of a 2-parter, I guess. How or why is that so when I feel like when people think of Vikings, you don't really think of Iceland first. You'll think of Norway and Denmark and then a little bit of Sweden, which are not really next to Iceland. So I feel like why wouldn't Norwegian or Danish be closer?
Yeah, so the first part of that, Icelandic is definitely structurally and in terms of vocabulary, the most like Old Norse of any living language. Icelanders are reasonably able to read Old Norse texts. I say reasonably able because this gets exaggerated. Part of the exaggeration is because mostly those Old Norse texts are changed into modern Icelandic spelling for a modern Icelandic audience. And I have met Icelanders who were not aware Old Norse spelling was different from modern Icelandic spelling. And so, like, they're at a little bit more of a disadvantage if it's actually presented as Old Norse qua Old Norse and not modernized spelling. The difference for a language written in the 1200s to today, really strikingly low. It's more like the difference from Shakespeare or the King James Version of the Bible, especially if you take like First Folio spellings to modern present-day English. It's more like Old Norse than the continental languages. There's a phenomenon in linguistics, provincial conservatism. Languages on the periphery, spoken by isolated communities, tend to change somewhat at a slower rate than languages spoken in more central places with a more cosmopolitan. This is true of English too. If you look at the UK, London English, especially if you consider strata of London English, like Cockney, has changed pretty fast, does change pretty fast continually from generation to generation. But there's a lot of really conservative features in, say, Scottish or Welsh or Hiberno English that are not present in Southeast England. Same thing sort of in the US. Country dialects, broadly speaking, often have archaic features relative to city dialects. And so Iceland is just an example of this writ large. It's a community that's isolated for a long time. Another thing is that it was a pretty literate society from pretty early on. And if you have a written standard to compare your spoken language to, that can act as a little bit of a brake on language change. So today, for example, in the history of English, the T disappeared in, often O-F-T-E-N. But because it's there in writing, people say it. So that kind of spelling pronunciation can semi-artificially preserve older features too in a really literate population. So yeah, it's not really a surprise that Icelandic would be more conservative linguistically than Danish or Norwegian or Swedish. It's maybe just a little bit of a surprise that it's as linguistically conservative as it is. But there are other languages that are comparatively conservative. Lithuanian is one. Lithuanian has remained very, very structurally conservative. So.
Interesting. Little fun phenomenon. Now, as a linguist, I do have just a fun little question. If you could bring back any letter from Old Norse to the modern alphabet, what would you bring back?
Well, the Icelanders do still use thorn, right? The letter for right? The sound in thorn or thin or theater. I would bring that back because it's not a combination of T and H. It is its own distinct sound. It's an interdental fricative. In my own writing for myself, for probably 20 years, I have used thorn and the voiced equivalent ev in English, although only really for myself. It does make writing a little bit faster, not having to write the two letters.
I won't disagree with you because I did see somewhere on the internet someone had written a full-on English sentence, but instead of writing TH, they'd put thorn. But the only thing going through my mind as I sort of read it silently in my head was, wow, you would either know what this is or you would just think that the person who wrote this has a really big lisp.
They would think it, because the problem is that if you're not used to reading it, thorn looks like P. In fact, as someone who has to look for Icelandic books in libraries all the time, I have this, groaning acknowledgement that I usually have to search for any thorn in the title as a P, because most librarians don't know what thorn is, and I have to search it as P. I think if you did bring back one of the letters into English, realistically, it would have to be ev, because it looks less like an existing letter. Although, again, searching for Icelandic books in libraries, I usually know people are going to assume that's an O. It's tough. But then in Old Norse or Old English or Icelandic, there's actually not many P's, right? P is actually a pretty rare sound in Old Germanic languages. There's not that many P's for it to get confused with.
It is if you're not a modern person, I guess. So I want to get to the poem. The last question I do want to ask is, so as someone who professionally gets to be surrounded by Old Norse culture and studies it professionally, we have a lot of Viking adaptations, a lot of movies, TV shows, plays, video games, you name it. Now, most of them do center on either Ragnar Lothbrok or something, right, from proper Scandinavia. So I'm curious, for anyone who's who's interested, do we have something that's more based off of Icelandic or not really? And, if there isn't, is there something you'd like to see done, adapted, that would be different from the sort of norm that we have?
I think several sagas would actually make pretty good movies or TV adaptations. I think I've never actually seen the Vikings TV show, although the video I released today was commenting on some Old Norse language scenes in it, but those were gathered by somebody else. I think that show is based somewhat on the legendary material about Ragnar Lothbrok, although even that's mostly not the Icelandic material. It's mostly the Danish material about him. I translated the Icelandic material about him in my second book, The Saga of the Volsungs, with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Trying to think if there is something that's a little bit more Icelandic based. There's a few not great movies from the 80s that you can find here and there. There was an Icelandic movie called The Outlaw. It almost uses the saga of Gisli Sorsson as a script. There's another one called The Raven Flies, which is kind of a smash up of a bunch of sagas. There's one from 1995, The Guy You Hire If Arnold Schwarzenegger Doesn't Return Your Calls. I can't remember what his name is, but it's called The Viking Sagas. All of these movies, fairly low quality. The Outlaw, at least, is based on a real saga. The Northman that came out last year, a lot of that is set in Iceland, so I guess that's more like the sagas, although personally I found that movie really boring and not spiritually much like the sagas. So I feel like that stuff is kind of lacking out there, but big asterisk, I'm a huge curmudgeon about these things. I don't like most Viking media, and I avoid it assiduously. So there may be stuff out there that I'm just not aware of and I'm never going to see, because the last thing I want to do in the evening is watch some Viking show.
It makes sense. Not all classicists love any kind of reception-y material because it's too close to work, and you do want to delineate between your work life and professional life. And I think it does get lost sometimes that for people who study this stuff, we may not actually want to see every 300 kind of adaptation that ever crosses our path, unless you're crazy into reception.
I always laugh at this because people act like it's some professional dereliction if I don't know something about like the actors in the Vikings TV show. There's a whole lot of material that actually survives from medieval Iceland that I spent a lot of time in grad school learning. And I'm not a fanboy of the show that you like. People are such evangelists for the media they consume. I don't return the favor. I don't try to get you to listen to the music that I listen to or whatever. It annoys me that people do this. The other thing is, I'm not going to live forever. My day doesn't last forever. If I'm going to spend an hour not working, I live in Colorado. I'm not going to watch a TV show. I'm going to go outside.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of like the unspoken thing, right? That unless you sit down and explain it, people just don't. People like to assume that if it's your professional passion, then they assume that, this built off of some other passion. So you must know everything about your subject, including all of the media that's ever been done, because, who are you if you don't know?
Yes. And with me, because there's such a Norse pagan subculture that's grown up now, I so often get this almost indignant question, like, you're not a pagan? It's like, well, no. Right. But people get really surprised about it sometimes. Like, well, how can you be so dedicated to the subject and translate this material and not believe in it? Pretty easily. Like, I don't know. I don't understand how this is such a big question to some people, but it is. I'm not saying anything against Norse pagans. A big part of my audience is Norse pagans, but I'm not personally one. And I don't understand that there has to be a direct connection between being interested in this and, worshiping Odin. So.
I totally agree. I think when I do occasionally encounter this type of thing, but obviously not pagan, but I think my response is, there are plenty of scholars who study both Christianity and Judaism that are not Christian or Jewish. So why is it implied that if you study it, you should be the thing? But also I'm coming from a very academic background, so I'm used to it, but maybe
this expectation is not evenly distributed. Like, classicists don't run into this the same way. Like, oh, you don't have an altar to Hercules. And then my favorite counterexample is, well, my best friend is a paleontologist and he never dresses like a dinosaur. Like, he's not convinced that he's a dinosaur. Like, I just don't understand. this expectation that you have to be what you study.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, classicists maybe don't deal with that as much, but I feel like I deal with it on the more cultural, like people when they know that I love Greece so much and I just eat, breathe, and sleep Greek culture, they're quite surprised when I say, Greek music is not one of my favorite genres at all. Like, I enjoy it if I go to Greece and I'm in like a taverna. But when they're like, what do you mean you're not out here like listening to like Helena Paparizou like every second of your life? I'm like, well, so it's quite surprising when people hear that like traditional Celtic music is my favorite.
I note that you're not wearing a toga. And this really confuses me.
Oh no. I left my toga at home and I left my olive wreath at home because obviously I wear it as a tiara every day because I look so extra. But no, I unfortunately don't have any of this. And, I don't even have a statue of Athena anywhere on my desk. I'm disappointing the entire classics world and all of its fans.
But I get this all the time, right? Like, well, the surprise that I don't dye my hair blonde and grow a 2-foot-long beard and have, Mjolnir tattooed on my fist or something. It's like, that's not who I am, right? I mean, I have my own culture, my own life. It's actually part of why I so deliberately have never changed how I dress. I wear a cowboy hat pretty often. It's just how I grew up. It's like, I deliberately kind of cultivate the dissonance. It's like I am not. I kind of want people to know, even though it probably hurts me with some of my audience. It's like I'm not telling you this because this is what I want to be. I'm actually a pretty neutral source, and I want you to appreciate that because I go home and don't try to be this.
Yeah, well, I am so shocked that you don't have a pet raven that just lands on your shoulder all the time. Tisk,
well,
tisk.
That part is actually like I'd probably really enjoy that as a huge bird person. There's probably some raven something I can reach out and grab from here.
You can be forgiven because the bird thing actually is like a very contemporary passion. So, bird watching, there's so many things. So, okay, we can forgive that one. I mean, there's so much in this discussion and all the media stuff that, we would be sitting here until we're both dead dust before we got through it all. So I unfortunately have to cut that off, but people can enjoy that lovely snippet. But I did want to ask you right before we get to the poem, when you were in school, and you can use either undergrad or grad school or both, did you attend office hours?
Yeah, I did. I mean, just for example, if I were working on some major translation or something, yeah, I would go run that by my professor in office hours. Sure.
Do you have a favorite memory just in terms of like an experience, a fun conversation, just something wild that happened during one of these office hours? And it can be the official or even unofficial, right? The office hours doesn't have to be sitting in an office.
Yes. My great professor, Dr. Klein at the University of Georgia, is such a language genius. I mean, truly one of these people who just sees languages as algebraic and just learns them almost instantaneously, it seems like. Famously went to Lithuania, knowing no Lithuanian, just studied how it was derived from Indo-European and yet communicated with people. But yeah, sitting in his office, him pulling out a book from the shelf, says, "Oh, I've got just the reference for you. Do you read Serbo-Croatian?" Like, no. It's like, well, you've got a plane trip coming up. Just learn it on the plane. I'll learn Serbo-Croatian on the plane. That sounds realistic to you. I doubt my ability to acquire a reading knowledge of this language in 2 hours, but okay. It's just the kind of guy he was. What he is. He was as my advisor, but now he's somebody else's advisor. That's still his program.
That's incredible. I wish I could learn languages just like snapping my fingers and being like, I got this, I can get this. So that's a skill. That's a skill. I mean, I'm quite envious of polyglots. I have a friend who's a hyper polyglot, speaks like 9 languages, 8 of them pretty fluently, and I'm like, well, I'm not on that level. I never will be, but
I'm decent at languages, but a lot more of it is interest than inherent talent.
I think learning language is a fun, rewarding, but very hard experience. So if you have the wherewithal to even want to pick them up, I think it's admirable either way. Being an educator yourself and having taught at several institutions, if you were to give like a 30-second to a minute long elevator pitch for why students should go to office hours, what would you say?
Your instructors are not expecting you to come to office hours, so they will remember you better. The students that I remember best are the ones who came to office hours. That certainly comes up in writing letters of recommendation. If I had a class of 300 students, the ones I'll actually write letters for are the ones whose names I remember, and those are typically the ones who came to office hours.
It's a good reason as any. And professors are fun. My favorite one decided that she was going to help me, teach me how to do taxes, because I came to her office and I was just in a panic one day and I was complaining about life and I don't know how to do my taxes. And she was like, "Do you want me to teach you?" So I got tax help, and then I benefited from her chocolate drawer. So best of both worlds. Well, anyway, at the end of each podcast, I ask if each guest will read a copy of Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And then once you've read it, I'd be curious to just get your thoughts on, what does this poem mean to you? What do you think it means? And it is continually cited as a poem that is, I want to say kind of timeless, kind of greatly admired, and I would love to know if you agree with that sentiment.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Suppose my take on it, such as it is probably a pretty common one. It's an awesome poem. I was a big Breaking Bad fan and appreciated the shout outs to it in the last season. There was even a promo for the last season that had Bryan Cranston reading it pretty memorably. I mean, as a statement of what lasts and what doesn't, I think that it's as good a reminder as any. Terribly memorable. Somehow reading it, I sort of feel the heat of the desert. Shelley's an evocative poet all around. I think that's worthily considered his best. But
yeah, I totally agree. This has been my favorite poem since I first read it. I want to say when I was in middle school, but I don't remember if I read it in middle or high school, but it's been my favorite poem since then. And you're right. It's this idea that it evokes a sense of monumentality, kind of questions what qualifies, what is monumental, what is legacy, what is long lasting. The fact that, Shelley writes this poem and he's basing it off of a statue of Ramesses that is being transported to the British Museum back when he wrote it in the 1800s and was very inspired. The way that he describes it sort of from a third person angle is very interesting. And from, just having studied classics, it's a quite brilliant memento mori, a reminder that we will die, which I really love. But I also love it because I find it personally to be a political statement by Shelley, just on the nature of power, especially political power, but all power, really. And if we're considering the poem in this way that I believe Shelley intended us to, if we stop and consider our contemporary society right now, do you think we have a modern Ozymandias, something we thought was so great and will last forever and is amazing and it will, never go sort of out of fashion? But realistically, will humans in 300, 400, 500 years think the same?
I think any given pop culture thing is much more fleeting than people act like it will be. The thing that reminds me the most of Ozymandias is this Akkadian poem called The Dialogue of Pessimism. Have you ever read that?
No, I have not, but I want to look it up now.
Yeah, that's a master talking to his servant. The master keeps saying, I'm going to do this or that. And the servant says, first, oh, that's a good idea, master. But then he gives him some other side of it that's kind of negative. And then the master says, well, then I won't do it. And then the servant sort of says, well, but if you don't do it, like, so the servant kind of keeps showing different sides of different things he considers. It's not very long, but one of the things he says is, oh, well, I'm going to do something great for the city. And the servant says, oh, yes, and there'll be a great monument to you. And the master says, well, yeah, maybe I won't. And the servant says, yeah, go up to the hill where the dead are carried and tell me which skulls belong to the men who did great service for the city and which ones belong to the criminals. Like, yeah, it's very Ozymandias sounding. It's great. You can find, I think there's some website by an Acadianist that has a translation of it.
Definitely have to check that out. I've been playing my way through a historical video game because I do Archeo game both personally and professionally. But I've been playing my way through House of Ashes. It's one of the horror games done by Supermassive Games, the same people who did Until Dawn, and they set theirs based off of Sumerian mythology with the Curse of Akkad, and so it's got all this cool ancient stuff, and they really go deep into the curse, and that brought up a lot of Ozymandias type things of the sack of the temple at Nippur, and then building this massive temple to sort of absolve Naram Sin of his faults, and they thought that was going to stand, and then, well, at least in the game, it gets destroyed like that, and then you're like, oh, well, that didn't last.
And by the way, if you want to talk to an Acadianist, I know an Acadianist, so I can connect you to an Acadianist. So please.
I want all of the people who do all the cool ancient things. So I'm always 100% willing.
Well, I know people. I could probably connect you with someone who could talk about just about any ancient language. So honestly, if there's something you're looking for, like I want to talk to a Hittite guy or something like that, let me know. I can connect you to people. So just email me.
The answer is always going to be yes, and I want it all.
If you were looking for someone in a particular field, just let me know. Just email me. I can connect you to somebody. Probably.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. Well, anyway, the last question that I'm going to ask you, because the last question is going to be very easy. Where can people find you? Because I want to connect people to your work, both, just like all the cool things, all the books and the YouTube channel. I mean, we'll link everything in the show notes, but so they can, if they're not able to write it down.
Yeah, if you search for Jackson Crawford, you'll find me pretty fast. There are other Jackson Crawfords, including a guy who's written apparently some pretty popular cookbooks. But if you go on Amazon and you search for Jackson Crawford, the Norse myth books are by me. The cookbooks are not. YouTube and search for Jackson Crawford, you'll find me pretty fast. I have a website, jacksonwcrawford.com, where there's a list of videos that's semi-regularly updated. So yeah, I'm not too hard to find anymore.
Sounds good. Well, we'll make sure that we will go and we will link everything so people can find you. And we also want to link your Patreon so more people can come on and support you, because we here at the Ozymandias Project are very, very committed to lifting up people's scholarship, but also making sure they can pay their rent and eat, because those are important things, because academia is hard.
I appreciate it. So my social media tag is usually Norse by Southwest, Norse by SW. So my Patreon is patreon.com/Norse by Southwest. Just Norse by SW.
That's fantastic. Well, I love the play on with words there. So Thank you so much for agreeing to do the podcast and coming on and having a great discussion with me this morning. I so appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been very nice. Great questions. And all the best to you and your audience.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.